Chapter 1. The Battle. The sky was an unyielding gray, as if the heavens themselves had been bruised by the endless storm that raged overhead. The planet, once a thriving world of vibrant ecosystems, now stood on the precipice of extinction. It was a desolate place, scarred by decades of warfare and technological experiments that had taken their toll on the very soul of the planet. The once lush fields and forests had been transformed into barren wastelands, the rich, green life replaced by the charred remnants of metal and bone. Fires still smoldered in the distance, their orange glow flickering against the smoky horizon. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning synthetic fabrics, flesh, and oil. The battlefield, a great expanse of blackened earth, stretched for miles in every direction, littered with the broken bodies of fallen soldiers, both human and alien alike. Machines of war, designed for destruction, lay in heaps of twisted metal and shattered glass, abandoned and silent now, their purpose fulfilled. The clash of metal, the roar of weapons, and the cries of the dying had all faded, leaving only a haunting stillness in its wake. Amongst the wreckage, one figure stood motionless, like a statue carved from the bones of the very world itself. Her armor, a masterpiece of alien technology and human ingenuity, gleamed dimly in the dying light of the setting sun. It was a strange thing, this armor, a fusion of sleek, metallic plates and intricate patterns of glowing energy that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Each piece was designed to protect, to shield, to empower. Yet now, it was a prison. The woman inside it was no longer a warrior, but a captive trapped within her own creation. Her name was Serafina, and she had been a soldier for as long as she could remember. Raised on the principles of combat, honor, and sacrifice, she had fought for a cause she believed in, a cause that, in the end, had crumbled to dust around her. The galaxy had turned against its own, alliances had shattered, and empires had fallen. She had been part of something greater, but now, she was nothing more than a survivor, standing alone amidst the ruins. Her breath was shallow, labored, as she fought to stay conscious. The armor, though advanced beyond anything human technology could comprehend, was now more of a hindrance than a help. It had been designed for extreme environments, for combat, for survival. But it was not designed for what she was enduring now, a slow, agonizing suffocation, the weight of the armor pressing down on her chest, the cooling systems malfunctioning, and the vital systems that kept her alive beginning to fail. The temperature inside her suit was rising, and she could feel the sweat beading on her forehead, her body growing weaker with every passing second. The more she struggled to breathe, the tighter the suit seemed to constrict around her, like an invisible hand squeezing the life out of her. She could feel her pulse quickening, her head spinning, and the world around her beginning to blur at the edges. Her vision flickered between clarity and darkness as she stumbled forward, each step a desperate attempt to find help. Her thoughts were hazy, disjointed, memories of the battle and of her comrades flashing in and out of focus. The final assault had been swift, brutal, and unrelenting. It had been a surprise attack by the enemy forces, an enemy they had thought they had defeated months ago. But now, it seemed they were everywhere, their presence as overwhelming as the storm above. Serafina had fought valiantly, as had the others, but numbers had proven to be their undoing. The enemy had overwhelmed their defenses, and soon, it had all descended into chaos. She had been separated from the rest of her squad, fighting her way through the wreckage, determined to survive long enough to warn the survivors, to help them escape. But now, as she stood alone on the battlefield, there was no one left to fight for, no one left to save. Her mind began to drift, the edges of her consciousness growing dim. She had been trained for this, trained to survive in the harshest conditions, to push through the pain, to never give up. But even the strongest of wills could break when faced with certain death. She had heard stories of warriors succumbing to the weight of their own armor, suffocating in the very suits that were meant to protect them. It was a cruel irony, and one that Serafina was now facing firsthand. Her suit's systems had malfunctioned in the heat of battle, and now, trapped within its confines, she was slowly dying. Just as her vision began to fade, a new presence entered her awareness. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the back of her mind. But as it grew stronger, it became clear, a figure, a shape moving toward her through the haze of smoke and destruction. She had no strength left to fight it, no energy to resist, but her instincts kicked in nonetheless. She reached for her weapon, but it felt like her arms were made of lead. The world around her tilted, and she fell to her knees, gasping for air, her chest heaving in desperation. Her hands, shaking, dropped uselessly at her sides as she collapsed into the dirt, the blackness creeping in faster now. The presence drew nearer, a figure clad in the same battered armor as the rest of the soldiers. His face was obscured by a helmet, but there was something about the way he moved, something purposeful, something urgent. Seraphina's vision blurred completely now, and she felt herself slipping away. She could hear the sounds of footsteps, heavy boots crushing the broken earth beneath them growing closer. And then, a voice, soft but insistent, cut through the haze. "I'm here," the voice said. "I'm not going to let you die." She barely registered the words, her mind too far gone, but a sudden pressure on her shoulders jolted her back to the present. The young man, no older than 25, was kneeling beside her. His hands, though shaking, were gentle as he began working to remove the pieces of her armor. She wanted to tell him to stop, to warn him about the dangers of trying to remove the suit without proper protocols, but her mouth wouldn't obey. Instead, she simply lay there, too weak to protest, too tired to care. The first piece of armor came away with a hiss, revealing her pale skin underneath, slick with sweat. She gasped as cool air hit her exposed flesh, her chest rising and falling with renewed urgency. The young man continued, working quickly but carefully, as if he knew that every second counted. Her breaths were coming faster now, the air feeling almost foreign to her lungs after so many hours of suffocating inside the suit. It was a strange feeling, this sense of release, of freedom, even if it was fleeting. Her heart hammered in her chest as the young man removed the final piece of her chest plate, exposing the scars and bruises that marred her skin. Finally, she could breathe. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Her body, weak and trembling, seemed to come alive again, as if it had been starved of air for far too long. She tried to speak, to thank him, but all that escaped her lips was a hoarse rasp. The young man's hands were still at her sides, his touch surprisingly warm despite the cold atmosphere around them. "Don't talk," he said softly, his voice full of an urgency that made her heart race. "Just breathe. You're going to be okay." But as her vision cleared slightly, Seraphina could see the reality of the situation. She was alive, yes, but how much longer could she survive? The battle had torn her body apart, and while the young man had removed her armor, there were still far too many wounds, too much damage. She was a soldier, a warrior, and yet now, in this moment, she felt more vulnerable than she had ever felt before. Seraphina's world seemed to close in on her as her breathing grew more labored, the tightness in her chest a constant, suffocating reminder of the reality she faced. The young man, Derek, continued to work tirelessly, unbuckling the final pieces of her armor with a precision that spoke of both care and urgency. She wanted to tell him to stop, to warn him that it wasn't safe, that the armor was designed to protect her from more than just physical threats, but her voice failed her, and she was too weak to protest. All she could do was lie there, her head spinning, the darkness at the edges of her vision threatening to pull her under again. The more he removed, the more she felt the weight of the suit lift from her. Her chest expanded slightly, and the sharp, constricting pain that had threatened to overwhelm her began to ebb. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt such relief. It wasn't just physical, though. It was as if, with each piece that fell away, some part of her past, her duty, her responsibilities, was also being lifted. The weight of battle, the weight of survival, had been crushing her for so long that, for a fleeting moment, she wondered if this moment of release was what true freedom felt like. Her senses began to return to her as the last piece of armor, her chest plate, was removed, exposing her bruised, battered body. She felt the cool air against her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe, really breathe, without the constriction, without the pain. She didn't know if she should thank him, curse him, or simply collapse into unconsciousness. But when she opened her eyes again, it was to find Derek still kneeling by her side, his face etched with concern, his brow furrowed in concentration. His hands moved quickly now, adjusting the final mechanisms that kept her alive, his fingers working expertly as he connected wires and systems, checking for signs of life. She watched him in silence, unsure of what to make of this strange, unexpected turn of events. She had fought alongside hundreds of soldiers in her lifetime, seen their faces as they took their last breaths, heard their screams of pain and rage. But none of them had looked at her the way Derek did. None of them had cared for her life the way he seemed to, even if she was nothing more than an unknown soldier to him. His hands were warm as he gently placed her head against his arm, his touch surprisingly tender for a man who had been in the heat of battle. "You're safe now," Derek said, his voice low and steady. But there was a tinge of something deep and concerned in his tone that made Serafina's heart flutter unexpectedly. "I'm not going to let you die out here." The words should have reassured her, but they only made her feel even more vulnerable. She wasn't used to this tenderness, this care. She had always been a soldier, a weapon, someone who fought and protected, not someone who was protected. The life she had known had always been one of grit and survival, where weakness was a luxury no one could afford. But here, now, with Derek's warm hands on her, it felt as though everything she had ever believed in was slipping away. She felt small, fragile in a way that frightened her. "I can't." She tried to speak, but her voice faltered, hoarse and weak. Her body shook, but it wasn't just from exhaustion. There was something about the way he looked at her, something about his genuine concern that was making her feel exposed, raw in ways that had nothing to do with the armor she had just shed. "You can," Derek insisted, gently brushing a lock of her matted hair from her forehead. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here." Her chest tightened at his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him, but there was a part of her that remained wary, a part of her that still held on to the lessons of her past. Soldiers didn't rely on others, didn't need help. They fought until their last breath, until there was nothing left to give. Yet here, in this moment, Serafina felt herself on the precipice of something she hadn't anticipated, a connection that went beyond mere survival. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken thoughts, feelings neither of them had words for. But as Serafina's breath steadied and her strength began to return, she couldn't deny the sense of safety that Derek's presence brought her. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting herself relax into him, her body no longer fighting against the armor that had almost killed her. Chapter 2: The Awakening. The air around Serafina felt different now. The oppressive weight of her battle armor was gone, and in its place, there was an unfamiliar sense of lightness, both physical and emotional. She didn't know how long she had been unconscious, but when her eyes fluttered open again, the world seemed brighter, clearer. Derek was still by her side, kneeling in the dirt, his back to her as he scanned their surroundings, alert and watchful. His posture was relaxed but attentive, as if he knew that danger could still be lurking. The battle, however, was far behind them. The sounds of war had faded into the distance, and now only the hum of nature remained, a stark contrast to the violence of the planet's previous hours. The wind whispered through the broken ruins of the nearby structures, a gentle reminder of the planet's lost history. The air smelled of charred metal and earth, but beneath it, there was an unexpected freshness and indication that, perhaps, this place would one day heal. Serafina sat up slowly, wincing as pain shot through her side. Her body ached, every muscle protesting the effort, but it wasn't the unbearable pain that it had been when she was still trapped in her armor. She could breathe now, her lungs full of air, unimpeded by the tight suit that had constricted her. She reached for her side, feeling the remnants of bruises and burns on her skin. The damage had been severe, but she was alive. That was all that mattered now. "Easy." Derek's voice interrupted her thoughts. He was immediately at her side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder as she tried to rise. "You've been through a lot. Take it slow." Serafina looked up at him, meeting his concerned gaze. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite place. But it was there, a connection between them, fragile yet undeniable. He hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't asked to save her, hadn't signed up for the consequences that came with pulling her from the battlefield. Yet, here he was, offering her more than just assistance. He was offering her something she hadn't had in a long time: care. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice gruff, though she hated the way the words sounded. She didn't want to seem weak, even though she knew she was, in this moment, more vulnerable than she had ever been. Her pride fought against the instinct to lean into his support. Derek didn't flinch at her words. Instead, he nodded, as if he understood. I'm not giving you pity. I'm giving you the chance to live. You deserve that much. Serafina found herself at a loss for words. She hadn't expected him to be so calm, so understanding. In truth, she hadn't expected anything from him. She had always been taught that survival was a solitary journey, that it was something earned through blood, sweat, and the will to keep fighting. Yet here she was, relying on the kindness of a stranger, a young man who had no reason to help her, yet still chose to do so. She nodded slowly, as much to herself as to him. Thank you, Derek. The air around them seemed to grow still, the moment stretching longer than it should have. Serafina felt a strange pull toward him, a sense of gratitude that made her chest tighten. She wanted to say more, to explain that she wasn't some helpless soldier, but words failed her. Instead, she stood, using Derek's hand for support, and took a deep breath. The world was still alive, and she, too, was still alive. I don't know what happens next, she said softly, her voice steady but uncertain. But I don't want to be a burden. You've already done enough. You're not a burden, Derek replied, a faint smile touching his lips. And we're not done yet. The war's not over, Serafina. You've got a second chance. You should take it. For the first time in days, Serafina allowed herself to truly relax. She wasn't alone. She wasn't fighting on her own anymore. The future, whatever it may hold, was uncertain, but with Derek by her side, she felt like she could face it. They stood together, looking out over the wreckage of the battlefield, both unsure of what came next. But one thing was clear, they were no longer just survivors. They were partners, bound by a chance encounter and the fragile hope that they could survive whatever the universe threw at them next. The silence stretched between them as Serafina stood, her legs wobbling slightly under her, as if the earth itself had been unsteady since the battle had ended. Every step she took felt strange. Unfamiliar, her body was a vessel of aches and pains, reminding her that survival was never easy, even after the bloodshed had ended. Derek remained by her side, his eyes constantly flicking between her and the horizon, ever watchful, as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. Where are we headed? Serafina asked, her voice quieter now, as though the very act of speaking had brought her closer to the reality of her situation. Derek glanced back at her. We'll head for the ruins of the outpost to the north. It's a safe spot for now. We need shelter until we can figure out what to do next. She nodded, accepting his plan without question. There was no argument in her, no resistance left in her spirit, at least not for the moment. She had fought so long, survived by instinct and will alone, that it had become second nature. Now, though, there was a strange peace settling over her, an unfamiliar feeling she hadn't known in years. The weight of her survival had been lightened by Derek's presence. He had saved her, not because it was his duty, but because he had chosen to. It was this simple fact that had unsettled her, the realization that someone could care for her without any expectation, without any reward. With Derek leading the way, they moved through the devastated landscape, the remnants of war at their feet, broken structures, charred trees, twisted metal that had once been vehicles. Serafina felt a pang of grief at the sight of it all, a reminder of the battles lost, the lives taken, and the endless cycle of destruction that seemed to plague her world. The Drajan Empire had once been powerful, untouchable. Now, all that was left were the memories of what they had been, and the ruins of what they had destroyed. Did you know? Serafina asked suddenly, her voice trembling with the weight of her thoughts. Did you know about the war before it came to this? Before the destruction? Derek didn't immediately answer, his expression growing more somber as he continued walking. Finally, after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low. I was raised in the Outer Rim. War is all I've known. But I didn't know it would come here, not to a place like this. The galaxy's so full of fighting, so full of broken promises. I thought I could make a difference, but... He trailed off, and for the first time, Serafina saw the uncertainty in his eyes. You did, she replied without thinking. You did make a difference, Derek. You saved my life. Derek gave her a sideways glance, but he didn't speak again. Instead, he continued forward, his pace steady, And for the first time since their fateful meeting, Serafina didn't feel the overwhelming need to speak to fill the silence. The words between them no longer felt necessary. They had already formed an unspoken bond, one that was stronger than any words they could exchange. As they continued on through the shattered remnants of civilization, Serafina's mind wandered back to her own people, the Dragon. Her heart ached for them, for everything they had lost. She had been the heir to the throne, the daughter of the last emperor, and now she was the last of her kind. She wondered if there was anything left to rebuild, anything that could be salvaged from the ashes of their empire. She was a princess in name only, but in her heart, she was just a survivor. She had been trained for war, for leadership, but nothing had prepared her for the devastation she now faced. "Derek," she began quietly, breaking the silence again, "what will we do now? After all this?" Derek glanced at her as they continued walking, a hint of concern crossing his features. "We'll survive. We always do." Chapter 3, A Future Unwritten. Night had fallen by the time they reached the outpost, a once thriving military facility now reduced to little more than skeletal structures and abandoned equipment. The air was cooler now, the wind picking up as they entered the shadows of what had once been a bustling place of defense and strategy. There were no signs of life, no fresh tracks in the dirt, only the remnants of past battles and forgotten soldiers. It was a quiet, eerie place, and it seemed as though time itself had frozen here, preserving the final moments of the outpost's existence. Derek led Serafina to the central building, a reinforced structure that had once housed command and communications. It was still intact, though battered by the years of conflict. The walls were scorched in places, and the windows were shattered, but it would provide shelter for the night. Serafina sank onto a makeshift cot, the exhaustion of the day's trek finally catching up with her. Her muscles ached, and her head swam with dizziness as her body tried to recover from the strain she had placed on it. Derek set to work securing the area, checking the communications equipment and ensuring that their position was safe for the moment. He moved with the precision of someone who had been trained to survive in hostile environments, though Serafina could see the strain in his movements. He wasn't just concerned about her well-being, he was worried about what came next. She could feel it, too. The weight of their situation, the knowledge that survival was no longer just a matter of chance, but a conscious decision they both had to make. As she lay there, staring up at the cracked ceiling, her thoughts turned inward once more. She had no idea what would come after the war. She had no idea what her role was now, what the future held. But one thing was certain: Derek had changed the course of her fate. She had been ready to die on that battlefield, to fade into the endless expanse of war and destruction. But now, because of him, she had been given a second chance. And while she didn't know what that future would look like, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. Eventually, Derek returned, sitting down beside her and handing her a small ration pack. She took it without question, her hunger overwhelming the nausea that had plagued her since she had awoken. As she ate, she felt the weight of her situation settle over her again. But this time, it wasn't just the weight of her past. It was the weight of the future, of a future she was no longer sure she could control. Derek glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "We can rebuild. If we can find others, people who are still fighting, we can do something. We can make a difference. I don't know if we can save this planet, but maybe we can give it a chance." Serafina finished her meal slowly, her mind racing. A chance? For what? For life, Derek said simply. For a future. She met his gaze then, something stirring in her heart. It was the first time in a long while that she had heard someone speak of the future not as an inevitable end, but as a possibility, an open road full of potential. She had been consumed by the past for so long, by the fall of her people and the weight of their demise, that she had forgotten to consider what could still be. There were so many unknowns, so much pain, but in Derek's words, there was something else: hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild not just a planet, but themselves. "We'll find others," she said, her voice steady. "And we'll give this world a future. We'll give ourselves a future." And as the night settled around them, they sat in the quiet ruins of the outpost, two survivors, bound not just by circumstance, but by the flickering ember of hope that had sparked between them, a chance to build something new. The next few days passed in a blur of quiet survival. Each day, Serafina and Derek explored the ruined outpost, checking for any useful equipment, any remaining supplies that could keep them alive. They found old ration packs, some still viable, and a few pieces of broken technology that Derek tried to repair in the makeshift workshop he had created in one of the abandoned rooms. The world outside remained still, as if holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The sky was overcast, a perpetual haze hanging over the desolation, but in the midst of it, something began to shift inside Serafina. Every night, as she lay on the hard cot, listening to the sounds of the wind howling through the broken windows, her mind swirled with the thoughts of her people, her fallen empire. She had once been part of something grand, something unstoppable, but now, with Derek at her side, she realized that the future wasn't something that just happened to her. It was something she could shape, something she could fight for. Derek had become more than just a companion in survival. He had become her anchor. The way he moved through the desolate corridors, the way he worked tirelessly to keep them safe, it gave her a sense of stability, something she hadn't known in years. He didn't ask for anything in return, didn't demand gratitude or recognition. He was simply there, and in his presence, Serafina found herself fighting not just for the future of her people, but for the chance to live in a world where they could start anew. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the ruins of the outpost in a faint orange glow, Serafina and Derek sat outside, on the edge of the building, watching the stars begin to appear in the sky. The world felt oddly peaceful in that moment, as if time had slowed, giving them a chance to breathe. "You know," Serafina said, breaking the silence, "I never thought I would be here, like this. Alive. After everything. After the war, after my people. I thought my life was over. That it had no purpose anymore." Derek glanced over at her, his face unreadable. "Purpose doesn't disappear just because the world changes," he said, his voice steady. "Sometimes it takes someone to make you see that. I'm here because I believe in that. In us." Serafina looked at him, feeling the sincerity in his words, and it stirred something inside her. She had always been driven by the duty to her people, the duty to uphold her family's legacy. But now, she was beginning to understand something else, that there was more to life than just survival. There was rebuilding from the ashes of the past, and finding something new, something worth living for. And in Derek, she found not just a partner, but a companion, a person she could trust in a world that had become so uncertain. "Maybe we can find a way," Serafina said softly, "not just for survival, but for rebirth, for the chance to make something new." Derek nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We can, Serafina. Together, we can." And for the first time since the fall of her people, Serafina felt hope stir in her chest. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Derek, and together, they could build a future that was not dictated by the past, but by the choices they made moving forward. The galaxy was vast, and there were still countless dangers lurking in the dark. But there were also opportunities, and she was determined to seize them. Chapter 4. The Choice. The following weeks were a period of quiet determination. Serafina and Derek spent their days scouting the surrounding areas for survivors. They had found a few scattered outposts and remnants of other soldiers, but no one had been able to offer much assistance. The war had claimed most of the galaxy's resources, and the survivors were few and far between. Still, they pressed on, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living, fighting for a future that didn't exist yet, but could if they were willing to work for it. One morning, as they were preparing to head out on another expedition to find supplies, Serafina noticed something different. Derek had been unusually quiet the night before, and his gaze had been distant. She had learned to read him, to understand the subtle signs that something was weighing on his mind. He was hiding something. "Derek," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she approached him. "What's going on? You've been quiet lately. What's bothering you?" Derek looked at her, his eyes filled with an emotion she hadn't seen before. It was a mix of determination and resignation. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. "There's something you need to know, Serafina," he said, his voice low. "I've been receiving signals from a nearby fleet. They're part of the resistance, those who've been trying to rebuild after the war. They've been searching for survivors, and they've picked up on our location." Serafina's heart skipped a beat. The thought of others who were still fighting, still trying to rebuild, was both a relief and a danger. The resistance could be their salvation, or it could be a trap. The war had created as many enemies as it had allies, and trust was a fragile thing in a galaxy that had been torn apart by conflict. Do we trust them? Serafina asked, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Derek hesitated, his gaze shifting to the horizon. I don't know. I'm not sure what they want. But we can't keep hiding forever. The galaxy is waiting for us to make a choice whether we fight to survive or fight to rebuild. Serafina's mind raced. She had always known that this moment would come, the moment where the choices they made would determine the future of not just themselves, but everyone they could still save. The galaxy was fractured, its people scattered and broken. But perhaps, together, they could offer something new. I'm ready, Serafina said, standing taller now, her voice resolute. I'm not just a survivor anymore. I'm someone who can fight for something more. For a new beginning. Derek met her gaze, his expression softening. Then let's go? We're not alone in this. We never were. With that, the decision was made. They gathered their supplies, and together, they set out toward the signal, the unknown, the uncertain, the chance for something more. The ruins of the past would not define them. They had the power to shape their future, and with every step they took, they were rewriting the story of the galaxy.